I still remember Claire saying, "Sit down, we need to talk," like I was an employee, not her husband. I forced a smile and said, "Did I do something wrong?" She didn't look at me. Ryan stood behind her, arms crossed, while Melissa opened a thin folder. Claire said, "This marriage is over. Sign these." I whispered, "Claire, I love you. Just tell me what you need." She replied, "I need a man who isn't useless." My chest burned. I said, "I built this life with you." Ryan smirked and said, "You built nothing." I snapped, "Stay out of this." Claire cut me off, "You don't get to speak like that anymore." I asked, "So you're really throwing me away?" She answered, "You no longer fit my future." Melissa slid the papers toward me and said, "Sign here." I shook my head and said, "At least look at me." Claire finally met my eyes and said, "I feel nothing." I felt my heart break. I begged, "Please just give us a chance." She replied, "I already gave you too many." Ryan leaned closer and whispered, "She chose me." I stood up and said, "After everything I gave you?" Claire said, "You gave me embarrassment." My hands trembled as I signed. Melissa took the papers and said, "You have 10 minutes to leave." I grabbed my small suitcase. I turned back and said, "One day you'll regret this." Claire said, "I won't." I walked out, hearing Ryan laugh, and I knew that moment had killed the man I used to be. I stepped into the hallway and told myself, I am not weak. My phone buzzed, but it was only a bank alert showing nothing left. I whispered, "I will survive this." Every step away from that office felt like I was shedding a broken skin. Even through the pain, I felt a strange spark of hope inside me. I promised myself I would rise, no matter how hard road became. I sat across from Melissa as she said, "Sign here to give up the house." I whispered, "That was my home." Claire looked away and said, "It was never yours." I swallowed and signed. Melissa added, "Now the car." I asked, "How am I supposed to live?" Claire replied, "That's not my problem." I felt smaller with every word. Melissa said, "These are your company shares." I laughed bitterly and said, "I helped build that company." Claire said, "You were just in the way." My hand shook as I signed again. I said, "So you're taking my name too?" Melissa nodded and said, "You'll go back to your old identity." Claire watched like she was bored. I stood up and said, "You're erasing me." She answered, "You were never important." I walked out into the street, feeling hollow. Daniel called and said, "Brother, Ryan isn't just her assistant." I replied, "I don't care anymore." He said, "You should." I hung up. That night I sat in a cheap motel and stared at my phone. I sent Claire a message saying, "I still love you." It showed blocked. I tried again and again, it showed blocked. I laughed and said, "So this is nothing." I remembered her sleeping on my shoulder when she was broke, saying, "I need you." I whispered, "Now you don't." I felt my chest tighten. I said to myself, "I gave you everything." The room was silent. My phone buzzed, but it was just another account closing. I clenched my fist and said, "You think I'm done?" I looked at my reflection and whispered, "I'm not." The pain didn't make me weak. It made me hungry. I promised, I will prove I was never worthless. I was sitting on my motel bed when my phone rang and I answered, "Hello." A calm voice said, "It's Hargreave." I froze and said, "Sir?" He replied, "I saw the news about your divorce." I sighed and said, "It's over." He laughed softly and said, "Not your future." I asked, "What do you mean?" He said, "Your startup shares just went public." I sat up and whispered, "How much are they worth?" He replied, "Enough to make you a billionaire." I said, "That's not possible." He said, "You invested with your father's money, remember?" I closed my eyes and said, "I never told Claire." He asked, "Why?" I answered, "I wanted her to love me, not my bank account." He said, "Well, she loved neither." I laughed for the first time in weeks and said, "So she divorced a billionaire?" He replied, "Yes, and she doesn't even know it." I said, "She thought I was nothing." He said, "You were always everything." I looked at my empty room and said, "I slept here last night." He replied, "Tomorrow you won't." I asked, "Is it real?" He said, "Your shares tripled overnight." I whispered, "My father would be proud." He said, "He believed in you." I felt something warm in my chest. I said, "Claire took everything from me." He answered, "She took what she could see." I smiled and said, "She never saw the rest." He asked, "What will you do?" I replied, "I won't beg anymore." He said, "Good." I added, I won't chase her. He said, better? I told him, I will rise. He said, you already have. I ended the call and stared at my phone. I whispered, you threw me away. I laughed again and said, but you never knew who I was. I stood up and told myself, I deserve better. I wasn't angry. I felt free. I stepped into the conference hall and heard someone whisper, that's him. I smiled and said, good morning. A CEO shook my hand and said, we've been waiting for you. I replied, I'm ready to talk business. I saw Claire across the room, still tall and cold. Ryan stood beside her, trying to look confident. When the screen showed my name under the largest acquisition, Claire whispered, that can't be him. I walked on stage and said, thank you for trusting me. Applause filled the room. I said, let's build something powerful together. I saw Ryan's face turn tight. Claire stared like she had seen a ghost. After the meeting, she rushed toward me and said, I need to talk. I kept walking and said, do you? She grabbed my sleeve and said, please, just 1 minute. I looked at her hand and said, let go. She whispered, it's me. I replied, I know. She said, I didn't know you were. I cut her off and said, rich? She nodded. I said, you knew I was loyal. She lowered her eyes. Ryan stepped forward and said, we should go. I smiled at him and said, you should. Claire said, can we talk later? I answered, no. She said, I made a mistake. I said, you made a choice. She whispered, you're different. I replied, you made me that way. I turned away and shook another CEO's hand. I said, let's discuss the next deal. I felt Claire watching me. I didn't look back. That silence felt louder than any argument. I told myself, this is my moment. For the first time since she left me, I was the one being chased. I walked forward, calm and steady. I knew she finally understood what she had lost. I saw Claire waiting outside my hotel and she said, please just listen. I replied, you didn't listen when I begged. She whispered, I was under so much pressure. I said, you were under Ryan. She flinched and said, he lied to me. I asked, and I didn't? She started crying and said, I made the worst mistake of my life. I folded my arms and said, you called me useless. She said, I was wrong. I laughed quietly and said, you were cruel. She wiped her tears and said, I miss you. I replied, you miss what I am now. She shook her head and said, I miss us. I said, there is no us. She stepped closer and said, I'll do anything. I answered, you already did. She grabbed my hand and said, please? I pulled away and said, you signed the papers. She sobbed and said, I didn't know you were rich. I said, so that's the truth. She said, that's not what I meant. I replied, that's exactly what you meant. She fell to her knees and said, I love you. I looked at her and said, you love security. She cried harder and said, you're being cold. I said, you taught me. I remembered her eyes when she said she felt nothing. I said, do you remember that day? She whispered, yes. I said, that's when you lost me. She looked up and said, can't you forgive me? I answered, I can't forget. She reached for me and said, we can start over. I stepped back and said, you don't get to rewrite me. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, but I also felt strong. I knew she wasn't in love. She was afraid of losing everything I became. I was in my office when Daniel called and said, it's over for Ryan. I asked, what did you find? He replied, he stole company money and leaked secrets. I smiled and said, so the truth is out. He added, Claire's investors are pulling out. I said, she built her empire on lies. He answered, her board is turning on her. My phone rang and I heard Claire sobbing, I need you. I replied, you need what I have. She cried, Ryan ruined everything. I said, you let him. She whispered, I was blind. I answered, you chose to be. She said, please help me. I replied, you didn't help me. She begged, I'm losing everything. I said, now you know how I felt. She said, I'm scared. I told her, so was I. She whispered, you can save me. I said, I already saved myself. She cried, I loved you. I replied, you loved control. She said, I made a mistake. I said, you made many. She sobbed, I destroyed us. I answered, no, you freed me. She went silent. I added, I loved you once. She whispered, do you still? I replied, that man is gone. She said, I need you. I answered, you need a miracle. She said, you're being cruel. I said, you taught me that too. I remembered signing those papers. I said, you watched me lose everything. She cried, I didn't know. I replied, you didn't care. She said, I'm sorry. I answered, sorry doesn't rebuild a soul. She went quiet. I felt no joy, only peace. I realized her fall was not my revenge. It was simply the truth catching up. I met Claire one last time and she said, please just give me another chance. I replied, you already had every chance. She whispered, I will change. I said, you only change when you are losing. She cried, I still love you. I answered, you love what I became. She said, I need you. I replied, I need myself. She reached for my hand and said, don't leave me. I pulled back and said, you left me first. She sobbed, I was wrong. I said, being wrong destroyed me. She said, I am alone. I replied, so was I. She asked, can't we start again? I answered, you burned that bridge. She whispered, I miss us. I said, us was never real. She cried harder and said, I will do anything. I replied, you already did. She said, I will wait for you. I said, don't. She asked, why are you so cold? I answered, you made me strong. I remembered sleeping in that motel and feeling empty. I said, that pain shaped me. She said, you are hurting me. I replied, you taught me how. She looked at me and said, you are not the man I married. I smiled and said, you killed him. She whispered, I regret everything. I answered, regret is too late. I turned and walked away. I built my own company with people who respect me. I did not look back. I said to myself, I choose me. I stepped into a future she will never be part of and I felt free.